Good afternoon. My name is Harry Kazianis. I'm the managing editor of the National Interest. Today, I have the honor and privilege to be speaking with retired Marine Corps General Lieutenant General Gregson. General Gregson is the senior director here at the Center for the National Interest of our China and the Pacific program. He's an expert on all things Asia-Pacific, whether it comes to the pivot or the rebalance or just the general of U.S.-China relations and just what's happening on U.S.-China dynamics, is also U.S. alliance relations with Japan and various allies. So, General Gregson, I kind of want to start out talking a little bit about the pivot. And there's been a lot of talk about this since 2011 with Hillary Clinton's sort of famous article in Foreign Policy. And I kind of want to start there because there's a lot of challenges in U.S. foreign policy right now. We have the challenge of ISIS. We have the challenges in Ukraine. We have a NATO summit that's happening tomorrow or very, very soon. So I think the real question is, and this has been talked a lot about in the National Interest, can the United States effectively pivot or rebalance to Asia, sort of having all of these challenges, sort of having all of this sort of intellectual bandwidth being used up? Is it a possibility still?
It depends on what the pivot is. And the pivot, in my opinion, has, for lack of anything else out there, it's been assumed to be nothing but a military strategy. And it gets reduced down to counting things that we can count, a very simplistic thing. How many ships, how many airplanes, with our defense budgets going down, can we really put 60% of our forces in the Pacific, and those types of things. What's missing is the overall strategic piece that, if you go back to the article that Secretary Clinton wrote, one of the founding documents of the pivot, which became later called the realignment, which later became the rebalance. And when things keep changing names in Washington, it's something that's in trouble if you keep having to rebrand it. But she talked about having to be more, she talked about diplomacy, she talked about economics, she talked about a number of things, and very softly mentioned security. And our security element, our military forces in Asia are, of course, essential for anything that we want to do, but by themselves they're not sufficient. We need to have the rest of the rest of the policy, the rest of the strategy built around it, and we need to be specific about it. Things like the Trans-Pacific Trans-Pacific Partnership, things like foreign direct investment, business-to-business exchanges. We have a number of things that we can do, but we're not bringing this together in a cohesive whole. The name changes are interesting. It went from pivot to realignment. Realignment was pretty quickly abandoned because that was the name given to the Bush administration initiatives in 2005 and 2006, the Alliance Transformation and Realignment Agreement with Japan and the roadmap to implement that. So of course you couldn't name a strategy in this administration after the previous administration, so then we got the rebalance. But because, again, of the lack of conversation, the lack of advocacy for anything else in Asia, people look at the 2005-2006 Bush administration initiative, which had 19 different things in it. The last two left to be done, of course, are the famous ones and the difficult ones, a movement of about half of the Marines to Guam and the relocation of different bases in Okinawa. That comes to symbolize what people think of when they think of the rebalance, and that's a shame. We need to better articulate what we're trying to do, and we have, I think, an open door here with our allies and friends. They want us to declare what we're doing. Oddly enough, China is the only country, I think, that thinks the pivot is really happening. Mm-hmm. Everybody else has some severe doubts about it.
Okay. Turning a little bit, keeping with the theme of the pivot, there's a lot of talk, specifically in the national interest in different security circles, about things like the Airsea Battle concept, mm-hmm. offshore control. Mm-hmm. Last summer we had a very, I want to say at this point, almost famous debate between T.X. Hams and Bridge Colby, sort of mm-hmm. comparing and contrasting these two sort of concepts. Do you think sort of the security situation in Asia is overemphasized, and some of the things like diplomacy, ally relationships, trade, those things sort of get squashed. Is there too much of an emphasis on that security sort of dynamic?
There's too much emphasis on the security dynamic, but there's not a proper emphasis on the security dynamic. If you buy the notion that our relationship with China is exceedingly complex, we have at one point the rising power historical precedent, which is not comforting, the so-called Thucydides trap and all that. China is the fastest rising power in world history. We have a vital economic relationship with China. All of our allies and friends have a vital economic relationship with China. Nobody wants us to harm those economic relationships, and we don't want to harm our own economic relationship. Yet at the same time, China is our #1 major power security concern. And China's activities, I would argue, give us very good reason to have some significant security concerns about China. We need, because of the very complexity of this situation, we desperately need, in my opinion, to be candid in the extreme about what we're trying to do. Airsea Battle is one such topical thing that's out there. Even its proponents argue right on their website that it is not a strategy, that it's at best a limited operational concept. Tom Hammas's project started at the request of the Pentagon. The Pentagon decided that his idea was not the way they wanted to go for the moment, so they allowed him to go public, and of course he's been public with it, and he's arguing for a strategy. We need to have something that declares what our intentions are, what our interests are. We need to talk about how we're going to act if the situation becomes more tense. Whether you go completely with Tom Hammas's point of view or the Airsea Battle point of view is a decision another level down from what it is we're trying to do. I would argue that given our past history, we should have absolutely no territorial acquisition interest in China. I mean, that sounds trite, but we've never quite said that. We imply through a lot of things that enter the public media in the United States, some allegedly part of Airsea Battle, others just from various interests that want the Pentagon to buy various weapons, that we have aggressive intents toward the Chinese mainland. I would argue this is not a logical position. We have not chosen to implement regime change in a regime as odious as North Korea. What makes us think we're going to do that in China? If you're not going to do regime change in China, then you certainly should not be considering or even implying that you want to attack the mainland of another nuclear-armed power. That's not happened before in history. There have been different historical incidents of actual conflict between nuclear-armed states, 3 to be precise, and both sides have tried very hard to keep it contained. So if we're not going to, if we have no territorial interest in China, if we have no intent for regime change in China, then what's our interest out there? Our interest, I would argue, are the robust defense of the territory, the interest in the lives of our allies and friends. That puts that settles the first question of what you're trying to do when you start talking about what we're going to do with our military if the worst eventuality comes to pass. And I think that puts us on much more solid ground with our friends, with our allies, and it also makes clear to China that we have a public stance that we have no territorial acquisition interest in China, we have no intent to attack the mainland of China, but we're here to defend our allies and friends, and then we can start building a strategy from that and make it a declared strategy, make it something that makes it absolutely clear what our interests are and where we and how we intend to conduct ourselves if the worst eventuality happens. But we haven't done that. We have sort of a situation where China has various historical grievances. They are making very expansive territorial claims. They seem to be wanting to expand their influence, their territory, but they certainly don't make it clear. We don't seem to be clear. On the other hand, we're not making clear what our intentions are and what our goals are. And this, I would submit, with the two major superpowers is not a good position. We need to be much more clear on what we're doing if we're going to have a rational strategy and have a rational framework, if you will, for your first question, for all those things under the pivot.
Excellent. No, I think that makes a lot of sense. So I want to shift gears a little bit, and I want to move right to current events. About 2 weeks ago, we had a Chinese J-11 fighter jet and a P-8 Orion come very close to colliding. Apparently, the Chinese jet did barrel rolls over the P-8. It was a very, very tense situation. Apparently, they're within 20 feet of each other. So I'm going to kind of flip that situation a little bit. Let's suppose that they did not come within 20 feet. Let's suppose they collided. How do you think that situation would sort of pan out? I know this is a big what-if sort of question. We have sort of as a model the 2001 Hainan Island crisis. Do you think it would play out in a similar situation to that? Do you think it would create a major crisis in relations? How do you see it playing out in your view?
We were very lucky in the 2001 Hainan Island crisis that the pilot and the co-pilot of that airplane were able to, against a lot of odds, were able to bring it down to a safe landing if a very hard one crashed on Hainan Island instead of going into the ocean. If there was, I think the crew on board was something like 23, am I right?
I think so. I think so.
In other words, it was more than just a pilot co-pilot thing.
Right.
It was a large crew. If we'd lost those lives, what would have been the atmosphere in 2001? If we did have a mid-air collision, the results would be very, very bad. Would it be a crisis in relations? At the least, I would think. Beyond that, I'm not sure I want to speculate on it, but there is nothing good that can come from this.
I think that's very fair. My last question, another sort of a big think sort of question. It seems for the last couple of years, U.S.-China relations have they've moved from problem to problem, but the overall tenor has gone a little bit more negative. And sort of maybe taking the long view, out maybe over the next 5-7 years, where do you see the relationship going? You know, there's a lot of tension with the Chinese based on various salami slicing tactics, tensions with our allies, tensions with the Philippines, tensions with Japan. Where do you see sort of that long-term track going?
Well, this is premised on my belief that China's not being clear about their intentions. The United States is not being clear about our actions and intentions. So you have some groping going on. How far can we go? What do we do to protect the interest of our allies and friends? What do we do to help maintain the international order that enabled China's rise, that China now seems intent on modifying in their interest. We need to become clear on this, or it's just going to, I think, continue to raise doubt, confusion. It's going to make establishing rules of conduct between our two nations and between the official organs of our two nations, primarily the military, ever more difficult. We seem to find it difficult to have two conversations with China. On the one hand, we want to have positive conversations on the economic side. We want to promote the economic relationship. It's good for everybody for all the reasons that are readily understandable. But we seem to have difficulty being candid about things that really concern us. Often we say that, well, we raised it with the Chinese leadership in private. Well, I'm not sure that that's the most effective way to change behavior. The Chinese citizens are becoming much more worldly aware. Certainly they're one of the most wired societies ever, if not the most, and active in social media and things. We have valid concerns on our side. The Chinese public deserves to hear these valid concerns. Not in my memory, not until Secretary Hagel was visiting Beijing recently did we have a sharp, frank, and candid exchange of opinion and marked differences between the Chinese defense minister and the U.S. defense secretary in public. There was another public, frank and candid conversation at the Shangri-La Dialogue, which followed not too long after that. Back to my point on candor, I think we need to do more of that. And businesses are able to do this. They're able to compete in one area and cooperate in another area. We, perhaps, conditioned by our experience in the Cold War, where we had an enemy right from central casting, we could call it an enemy, we had no economic relationship with it, so we could be frank and candid about it. I don't think since the War of 1812 have we had a primary economic partner who's also a security concern, and our habits of thinking, our habits of diplomacy and things, I think, are not are overconditioned by our experience in the Cold War, and we need to we need to be able to understand that we can have two conversations and it's not necessarily going to damage the economic relationship. On the other hand, on the relationships, we seem to be in the habit of responding things to China does that, whoa, gee, this will hurt the military relationship we're trying to have. Well, this kind of sounds like Facebook, that if you do this again, I'm going to unfriend you. Having a military-to-military relationship is valuable for the sense that you have to be able to have discussions, you have to be able to exchange opinions, you have to be able to be candid. But I think we need to be wary of overvaluing this, withdrawing or telling China that that something that they did is going to damage the military relationship, I think way overvalues what China thinks the military-to-military relationship is. They're always the first ones to suspend it whenever we sell arms to Taiwan, so apparently it's not something that they value as much as we do, but we have to find another metric to indicate our displeasure other than saying it's going to damage our relationship. Well, of course it is, but you know, what's the relationship? The economic relationship, the security relationship, or what? We're not, there's a lack of differentiation here in my mind.
Excellent. Well, I think we're going to have to leave it there. My name is Harry Kazianis. I've been speaking with General Chip Gregson, our Senior Director for the China and the Pacific Program here at the Center for the National Interest. General, thanks for joining us.
Harry, thank you.
Thank you.